I get into my message today, I want to read two Bible passages. This is the foundation or the basis of my sermon today. So the first Bible verse is in Galatians chapter 6. Галатам 6 глава, 4 и 5 стих. So Galatians 6, chapter 4 and 5. Pay careful attention to your own work, for then you will get the satisfaction of a job well done, and you won't need to compare yourself to anyone else. For we are each responsible for our own conduct. All right? So this is Galatians chapter 6, verses 4 through 5. This is the very first verse. The second one is in John chapter 21, verses 22 and 23. John chapter 21, verses 22 and 23. Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is it to you? You must follow me." All right? So these two Bible verses is the basis of my sermon today. And what I like to do is I like to take two phrases from these two, from Galatians and from John 21, and I want to build or name the topic of my sermon today. So the first phrase is, you don't need to compare yourself to anyone else. And the second one is, what is it to you? You must follow me. Okay? So these two phrases, I created my sermon topic, and it's called today, Stop Comparing. What is it to you? So the name of my sermon today is Stop Comparing. What is it to you? One of my favorite things that I like to do, or I used to do, I don't have much time anymore, is I like to fish. You know, I did like to fish, but with having many kids, you don't have the opportunity or the time to go fishing or to do anything much, you know. So I love the nature. I love the water. I love just the quietness. A lot of times when I have a moment of, I guess, free time while I'm driving, you know, I just drive down to the river where we used to fish, and I just sit there and just sit there, you know, and just look at the open water. I just love that feeling of water and nature. So every time we have an opportunity, you know, if we do have a chance with the kids, we go fishing. And those of you who know fishing with kids is not fun. It really becomes like a three-ring Barnum and Bailey, circus, I guess we could say, right? You're chasing one kid down that way, the other kid has got his line hook there, the one kid got the hook in his finger, and it's just chaos whenever you fish with children. But nevertheless, we still go fishing with the family. I like going fishing. Like I said before, I love everything about it. But I remember growing up, my brothers, I think it was Vitaly and Peter. I don't remember if Peter was there. I don't remember much about Peter for some reason, you know, but I think he used to go fishing with us. But my brothers and a friend that we grew up on the street by the name of Bobby, we would always do a lot of fishing down the Allegheny River, down by the penitentiary. What we would do is we'd pack our book bags with bread, with fishing rods, with hooks and sinkers and dough ball and many other things. And we'd take our bikes and we'd go down, actually not the Allegheny River, I apologize, the Ohio River by the penitentiary. It was the Ohio River. And we would go down there and fish for carp. Those of you who ever fished for carp understand that it's a fun thing to catch carp. It's a bad thing to eat carp. They're not good. Maybe some people eat them, but it's really, really fun to catch carp because they're massive, they're huge fish. So the way we would catch them is we would take bread, we would throw them, you know, on top of the water. You know, take a couple loaves of bread, it was cheap at the time, and we just float on the water. 10, 15 minutes, you might have, say, 3 loaves of bread just floating around, and you would have literally 10, 20, 30 carps just munching and eating on this bread. You know, they would just gulp this bread. They would eat this bread. And this was our clue that they were ready to be plucked, I guess, to be ready to be caught. You know, so what we would do is we would take our fishing rods, we would take our hooks, we would put them in the bread, we would fold them, and we would just float them out into the river. You won't believe the amount of fish that you would catch, one after another, you know, 10, 15, 20, whatever it was. During our fishing trip, we would catch so much carp. But the thing is with those fishing trips would turn into a competition all the time. I don't know if it's just a boy thing or a teenager thing, but those trips would always turn. Thank you. We miss Tori because he always brings water up here. So Tori, thank you for bringing water up here. But those fishing trips would turn into a form of competition, right? Would begin to occur. we would begin to see who would catch the most fish, in an hour or two of span. And for some reason, our friend Bobby, he would always catch the most fish, right? I don't know if he put some special cream that we didn't see on the bread. I don't know if he had maybe some special hook, that sent out some secret signals. I have no idea. But every time we would go, he would always win. He would always catch the most fish, I remember the one time in an hour span, he caught, it was about 20 carp in an hour. We're standing there like, how are you doing this? How are you catching all this fish? Me, my brothers only caught 5, 10 at the most. He would always catch the most fish. So every time, a friendly fishing trip would turn into this jealous, this bitter, this angry, this defeated experience for me. I don't know if my brothers felt like that or what, but for me, I always lost. I don't remember even saying these prayers to God. I remember even praying these holy, righteous type of prayers. Hey, God, look, I'm a believer, right? I'm a Christian. I do not sin. I go to church twice a week. We used to go to church, I think, on Saturdays at that time as well. I am your child. Why am I not beating this kid, right? He's unchristian. He doesn't know you. He doesn't care about you. Why is he always winning? Shouldn't I be better? Shouldn't I have more? Shouldn't I always be a winner than this heathen, I guess you might call him, right? This unchristian kid? Shouldn't I prosper more? Shouldn't I be more successful? Why do I not have more? Why do I not have the ability, to catch and at least one time catch more fish than him? This is just a simple little story, I guess, or a little simple example. But how many times with these examples, these stories, right, we ourselves live these out? Where we begin to compare, our situation, right? We begin to compare our life. We begin to compare our families, to that of someone else. How many times in our own lives these competitions occur with the people that we live, where we begin to compare everything. We look at our neighbor's house. We say to ourselves, why is it that I don't have that type of house? Why is it that I can't buy that house? We look at that car, expensive or new, whatever they might be, right? We begin to say to ourselves, why is it that I do not drive those vehicles? Why am I not sitting behind that car? We look at the dress. We look at the outfit. We look at her shoes, women. We look at their purses. I don't know what else women look at. All right? We begin to think about our own outfits, right? Our own closets. We begin to say to ourselves, why is it that person has this, or this woman or this lady has this, and I don't? We look at their finances. We look at ours. We look at our own bank accounts, and we see how little we have, and we see how much more somebody else has. We look at our friends' social media apps, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, all these apps that are available today, right? We see so much what other people are doing, where people are traveling, what people are experiencing, what they are doing in their lives. And we ask ourselves again, why is that not me? Why is it that I don't experience or live their life? We begin to compare, and we begin to compare ourselves to that of somebody else. Time after time, month after month, year after year, we live through these type of moments where we take a person or a thing, we place ourselves on these balancing scales, right? And we begin to compare our lives with that of someone else. We begin to compare our families. We begin to compare our children, to their children. We begin to compare our marriages. We begin to compare our spouses, right? Our husbands, our wives. Or maybe why they're not so beautiful or talented, or why they're not so successful, or why they don't have this or that, right? We begin to compare. We begin to compare our relationships even with God. We look at somebody else, we say, hey, that person's serving God this way. This person is more spiritual. This person is maybe more holier. This person is more righteous. Or this person is serving God in this aspect of his life. And we look at ourselves and maybe we're not doing those things. We begin to compare. We begin to carry around with us a measuring stick, measuring to see if their lives are better than ours. My wife went to Lowe's yesterday, and she purchased a yardstick. And I realize in life, so many times we carry around this type of yardsticks where we walk around. We look at a person, what somebody has done, what somebody has experienced, right? And we see, and all we do is like our cane, we walk around all day long measuring their life to our own lives, right? We think that they have everything. And we look at our own lives, we become dissatisfied, we become unhappy, we become ungrateful for what we have. We begin to measure their best features against maybe the average features that we have. We begin to measure their happiness, their worth against ours. Wonder why they're so happy, why so many times we are miserable. We begin to measure maybe their popularity, how bright, how funny, how outgoing they are. We begin to measure how everybody's drawn to them, how everybody's attracted to them. But we look at ourselves. We don't have maybe that many friends. We don't have maybe that many people around us. We begin to compare, and we begin to put ourselves down. We begin to measure the things they even do in church, the things that we all do for the glory of God, right? Everything we do, we measure people against ourselves. And the interesting things happen is whenever we walk around measuring ourselves to those of somebody else or somebody else against us, what happens is a lot of times is we take those results, right? We take that measuring stick and we come to God and say, hey, God, look, if you only have given me this ability, if you only would have given me what this person has, maybe I would be able to do this and that. How many times we ourselves, we say things like, if I only had his or her ability, say, to teach. If I only had his or her ability, to preach. If I only had his or her ability to sing. If I only had his or her ability to lead. If I only had their money. If I only had their looks. If only I had better parents. Only if I had a better husband or wife. If I only had this or that. We walk around all day long measuring what we think we do not have, but never realizing we have exactly everything what God needs us to have in this season of our life. I want to repeat this. We walk around time after time, right? We measure what we think what we do not have, but never realizing we have exactly everything what God needs us to have in this season, in this moment, in this part of our life. You see, churches, when you and I begin to compare, whenever you and I begin to take this measuring stick that I have, that is in front of me, whenever you and I walk around like this, we measure our lives. Whenever we begin to measure our accomplishments, whenever we begin to measure our talents, our gifts to that of somebody else, one thing happens in our life. Whenever we walk around with a measurement all day long, something happens. We become less and less of that person that God has called us and God has created us to be. When we walk around measuring every inch of your neighbor, when we walk around measuring every inch of their house, every inch of their car, every inch of their gifts, every inch of their talents, every inch of their lives, we ourselves are getting rid of what God has given us. Comparing your life to that of someone else allows Satan to begin to plant seeds of sin at your doorstep. Comparison is not a sin in itself. It's what happens in the moment whenever we compare. Whenever we compare, we can either make ourselves better, right? Sometimes we could look at a fellow brother or sister or whatever it might be, and we see that they have achieved certain things, and that gives us motivation to maybe get a better degree. Going back to comparing our lives, to that of somebody else. Allow Satan, to begin to plant seeds, right, at the center of our doorstep. And what I was saying before is comparing is not a sin, right? We sometimes will look up to a person who obtains certain things or has certain qualities or talents. We look at that person, and that gives us motivation to be successful, right? It gives us motivation to succeed. It gives us the opportunity to become maybe like that person. But is the thing that happens whenever we compare, whenever we allow, the sins of the things that are given birth whenever we compare, is what brings sin into your life. The more you measure, the less you become filled with God, right? The more we compare ourselves to somebody else, the less we become filled with God. You see, in Galatians chapter 6, verses 4 through 5, right? The verses that I read. In Galatians chapter 6, verses 4 through 5, pay careful attention to your own work, for then you will get the satisfactory of a job well done, and you won't need to compare yourself to anybody else. You know what's interesting about this passage here? If we read a little earlier, a couple verses before, Paul is writing to the Galatian church, and I guess the problem what was happening with this church was people were falling into sin, people were living a sinful life, and those who seen those brothers and sisters who were falling in sin and who were falling into temptation, they begin to compare their life to that life of a brother, right? They begin to look at themselves. They begin to say, listen, I'm not like that person. I don't live in sin like that sister. I don't live in sin like that brother. And they begin to compare their lives, their situation to the life of their fellow brother. And Apostle Paul here writes in Galatians and says, hey, listen, you need to stop comparing your life. You need to stop comparing your situation. You need to stop comparing your righteousness. You need to stop paying attention, stop comparing yourself to everybody else. You need to worry about yourself. Well, in the same way, today God is telling you, He's telling me, pay attention to your own life. Pay attention to your own blessings that God has given you. Pay attention to your own God-given talents that He has given you. Pay attention to your own spouses, to your own wives. God has given us so many wonderful families here, right? The marriages are strong and powerful. And God is telling you, look at your own wife. Look at your own husband. Look how beautiful, how amazing they are. There's no one else that's been created for you just like your wife or your husband. Pay attention to them. Pay attention to your own children. They are blessed. They are anointed. They're prepared. They're special. They are yours. Doesn't matter what the other children are doing. Doesn't matter what the other family's doing. Pay attention to your own blessing. Pay attention to your own church. Pay attention to your own pastors. Pay attention to your own leaders. Pay attention to your own members. Pay attention to your own people. God has given them to you. Stop comparing those who are somewhere else. God has given you your own. The interesting thing that happens, I'm running out of time, I apologize. There's three things that begins to happen in our lives whenever we begin to compare, right? There's three things begin to happen whenever we walk around with this measuring stick, measuring the accomplishments and the feats and the gifts of somebody else. Three things come from comparing. We begin to be filled with jealousy and envy, right? First thing, whenever we compare, we become jealous and envious of what that person has or what that person is doing. The second thing that comes after jealousy is we begin to get bitter. We become angry. We become ungrateful. We become unthankful, right? Whenever we compare, take a look at somebody and see what they have or what they're doing, that irritates us, right? We say, why is it? Just as me, as I was fishing with Bobby, why is it that he's catching more? Why is it that, I don't have that many fish? And lastly, we lose our focus on God and our relationship begins to crumble because jealousy and bitterness and love is no longer present in our life. You see, whenever we compare, those three things happen. Jealousy, bitterness, right? Ungratefulness, and we lose God. We lose our focus on what we have. There's a famous story in the Bible, it's in the Old Testament, that in many ways shows us what happens to people. I guess what happens to us, what can happen to you and me whenever we begin to compare, right? And allow comparison to seep into our lives. So the story is in first book of Samuel, chapter 18. I think we know the story pretty well. It's in the first book of Samuel, chapter 18, verses 5 through 13. All right? So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered. And Saul sent him over the men of war, and it was pleasing in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. It happened as they were coming When David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out all of the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. The women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain thousands, and David his 10,000s. Verse 8. Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? Saul looked at David with suspicion that day on. Verse 9. I'm going to keep reading a little bit more. Verse 10. Now it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house, while David was playing and the harp with his hands as usual, and the spear was in Saul's hand. Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall, but David escaped from his presence twice. Now Saul was afraid of David, for the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence and appointed him as his commander of 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. David was prospering in all his ways, for the Lord was with him. When Saul saw this, that he was prospering, he greatly dreaded him. In other words, he hated David. You know, before we concentrate on this passage that I've just read, I want to go back a little bit, I guess, to the very beginning of Saul's life, right? Where Saul began to compare his own life, where Saul became jealous of David, and his accomplishments. I want to start at the very beginning of Saul's life and the journey of Saul, and what led up to the point where Saul became so jealous, where Saul became so filled with hatred that all he wanted to do, or all his life's goal, was to kill David, right? And the story begins in the first book of Samuel as well, but this actually begins in chapter 8. And I'm not going to read everything. If you have time this week, please read the chapter, read the story of Saul and David. It's actually a very interesting story. We all know that God had a blessed life for King Saul, right? He was anointed and appointed by Samuel. But because of these bad choices that Saul made, specifically living the life of comparison, living the life of, I guess, the result of comparison, jealousy, right? Living only, to measure his own accomplishments or counting the blessings of somebody else. Those blessings never occurred in the life of Saul, as we know, right? It never occurred in his family, it never occurred in his kingdom. All those blessings that God had for him, they were removed from Saul. So in the 8th chapter of 1 Samuel, God tells Samuel the prophet, right? Listen, the people really want a king, right? They want someone to lead them. They keep reminding me, they keep praying, they keep pleading for me. That's all I do is hear their cries. And you, Samuel, yourself are seeing that the people want a king, right? They won't stop asking. They want to be like those other nations everywhere else, right? So in the first chapter, I guess in the first book of Samuel, chapter 8, verses 4 through 5, this is what it says. Then all the elders of Israel gathered and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us. And I love this last phrase, right? Appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. In other words, what the people of Israel, right, were saying, we want to have what they have. We want to be like them. We have compared our lives, we've compared our situations, and we want to be like those other nations who have a king. What's interesting about the people of Israel, right, is they began to look around. They saw the successes of the countries who had kings. They sing the blessings maybe of what those people had who had a king. Maybe they saw a more organized country that was led by a king. Maybe they saw people lived financially better and they prospered because they had a king. Maybe they saw that those countries were protected. Their borders were more secure. They were not attacked as much or looted or raided as much, right? I'm not sure what the people of Israel saw. But they began to look around. They began to look over to the other side of the country. And they begin to want. They begin to desire. They begin to compare. and they wanted a king. Remember the old saying, the grass is not always greener on the other side? Well, the people of Israel looked on the other side. They looked on the other side of the fence, and they saw those nations were doing better in their own eyes. Maybe they were not. But they looked over to the other side, and they saw that the sheep maybe were fatter. Maybe the grass was taller. Maybe the vineyards produced more. Maybe the communities were friendlier. Maybe the schools were better, right? Maybe the men looked more muscular. Maybe the women looked more prettier, right? Every time they looked, they saw with their own eyes something that they did not have. So they came to Samuel and said, Samuel, we want a king. We want a king now. So Samuel tells them, that's fine. You're going to get a king, but remember, having a king doesn't mean your life is going to be better. Having what you want doesn't mean your life is going to be better. You don't know what they are going through, what they are experiencing. And it says later on, I guess in the same chapter 8, what's going to happen. Remember, if you get a king, he will do this and that. He'll take your daughters for perfumers. He'll take your daughters to be cooks. He'll take your daughters to be bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your seed of your vineyard and give it to his officers. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of the young men and your donkeys and use them for his own work. Samuel looks at the people of Israel. He looks at his elders and he's saying, this is a bad business deal. This is not a good deal. What you are seeing is not good for you. You don't need a king. God has given you someone. Stop comparing your people. Stop comparing your life. Stop comparing your God to their gods. But the people says, no, we want a king. We see something better. We measured something and we found out that we need a king. I think we all know the rest of the story. God gives him a king, and that is Saul. Saul becomes the first king of Israel. You know, as I was reading the story of Samuel and the story of Saul, and the people of Israel, I got to thinking, was Saul part of these elders, or maybe part of the people in general who looked around and began to compare their lives, with other nations? Was Saul that person who maybe joined the people of Israel and began to say, listen, those people have it better? The Bible doesn't say whether Saul was the one they're comparing as well. But the one thing I do see happening in this story with the people of Israel and the story of Saul was happening among the people. Something interesting was happening among the people of Israel. There was a culture, I guess. There was a spirit of comparison that dwelled among the people of Israel. The people were not content with what they had. And unfortunately, sadly, the same spirit, the same comparisons, the same attitudes that were in the people of Israel also was in King Saul, as we see later on. As we go back to the verse that I have read, right? So David went out, whatever Saul sent him, and he prospered. And the women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can we have, what more can he have but the kingdom? Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. Saul had the same exact spirit. Saul had the same exact problem that the people of Israel had. He began to compare his life to the accomplishments of David. Saul began to compare his own successes, to this young and upcoming, this popular young man. I guess this cool kid, as we might say, the one who defeated Goliath that everybody worshiped, right? Saul began to compare his own to that of David. In his own eyes, Saul was no longer, the man that was on top, even though he was still the king. No longer is Saul the story in the front of Israel news. He was not the talk of the town. Every time King Saul would look at David, he would begin to compare his accomplishments, the things that he heard from the crowds, the things that he read about him, the things that were sung about him. He ate Saul alive. He began to compare. He began to walk around and measuring himself to that of David. As we all know, what happens whenever we compare? For Saul, it led to jealousy. When you walk around with a measuring stick comparing this and that, the first thing it leads to, as I said earlier, it leads to jealousy. Saul begins and becomes jealous of David. Whenever we allow jealousy to enter our hearts, whenever we allow jealousy to enter our lives, it begins to breed. It begins to give birth to exactly what it gave to Saul. It brings suspicion. It brings doubt. It brings mistrust. It brings bitterness. It brings anger. And it leads to nothing more but a broken and an empty relationship with God. Whenever we begin to compare, whenever we become jealous, that's what it leads to. A whole snowball effect of emotions, right? Of behaviors that become difficult for us to control. It starts all from comparing ourselves to somebody else, to what they have, to what they have accomplished, to what they have achieved, to what maybe God has given them just for their specific life. Whenever we begin to compare, just a whole snowball effect of emotions and problems come into our lives. Proverbs 14:30 says, "A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones." And that's what began to happen to Saul. He began to rot inside, deep inside. He had no more joy, what Ilya was talking about. He had no more happiness in his life. God was no longer in his life. He removed God from his life because he was only focused on David, on his accomplishments, on David's blessings. We know the rest of the story of Saul and David. Saul makes a commitment to destroy David at every corner. Verse 10 is the same in chapter 18. Now it came about the next day that an evil spirit from God came mighty upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house while David was playing. The harp was in his hand as usual, and the spear was in Saul's hands. Verse 11. Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I would pin David to the wall, but David escaped. When Saul saw that he was prospering, he dreaded him. He hated him. Saul's life's goal was no longer focused on serving God. It was no longer focused on serving and helping the people of Israel. Saul became focused solely on David and his accomplishments. Saul's life's purpose is no longer aligned with the vision and the plan that God had him to be the leader for the people of Israel. It begins to unravel. It begins to crumble. It begins to fall apart because he began to compare his life once again to the life of somebody else. Saul begins to engage in useless wars. Saul begins to consult mediums and go against God's laws. Right? Saul begins to lose his family. Saul begins to lose his kingdom. Saul loses his sons. And ultimately, if you read the rest of this story, Saul loses his own life. He just started from comparing his life from somebody else. I'm going to need Isabella a couple minutes. Use her an example. There's a game we played in camp. Isabella, can you come up, please? It's called chicken soccer. Those of you who are familiar with this game, it's a very fun, it's a very interesting game. And we're not going to tie this, but the point of this game is just like regular soccer, but the only thing is that you would have to wear with a string is 2 pairs of glasses like this. So you put them on. Just hold like this. There you go. And you would wrap it around your head and you would play soccer with these type of glasses, I guess, with these types of eyes. And be honest, it is one of the hardest things is to play soccer whenever you can't see what you're doing. Whenever you are focused in one particular way, when one eye is pointing to the left and the other eye is pointing to the right. Try kicking a goal. Try passing it to your teammate. Try seeing what is around you. It is impossible to play. All game long, all you're doing literally is acting like a chicken, right? You're bobbing your head to the left. You're bobbing your head to the right. You're going up. You're going down. All game long, you can't see what you're doing. Thank you, Isabel. Well, just as this game, chicken soccer, right? So many times we begin to focus on the wrong things. We begin to compare what others bought. We begin to look at what others have achieved, right? We look to the left at that person. Look to the right what that person has achieved, what that person obtained. We look at that person, maybe what he said, what he is doing. And our lives become this life filled of craziness, bobbing all over. We begin to act like these crazy chickens. And today, church, what God is telling us, it's a simple example. You and I, we need to stop comparing. We need to stop looking. We need to stop focusing on someone else and what somebody else is doing. Focus on your own talents. Focus on your own strengths. Focus on your own beauty. Focus on your own blessings. Focus on your anointings. Focus on your own spouses. Focus on your own children. Focus on your profession, on your own degrees. Focus on your own life that God has given you, for it is unique and different than that of somebody else. With Saul, it all started just by comparing. All by measuring his life to the life of somebody else. He was focusing on David, but not on his own life. You see, living the life of comparison leads to a life that is filled with jealousy. Then jealousy takes you to the road of bitterness and anger. And the anger takes you right off a cliff to a disaster end. I know it's mean or subtle, this is what I'm saying, but that's what jealousy does. That's what comparison does. It leads us to a life of unhappiness, a life of no joy, a life of no peace. Whenever we begin to compare our situations to that of somebody else, we have no more joy that is left in us. It would lead us right off a cliff. You know, as I begin to finish my sermon in just 5 more minutes, there's a story in the New Testament about, this was after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And whenever the disciples decided Christ was no longer with them, and they decided to go fishing one day, and Peter, John, and the other disciples said, you know what, let's do some fishing. So they went fishing all day long. They didn't catch anything. And as that day was breaking, as the story goes, is actually John chapter 21, verses 15 through 21, all right? John chapter 21, verses 15 through 22. I'm going to read a couple verses here. All right, so as I said before, the disciples went fishing, and as they were bringing their ships in, they seen this man, and this man on the shore is asking them, have you guys caught any fish today? And the disciples looked and yelled to this man, no, we've been fishing all night, and there's been no fish for us to catch. And this man, we all know who it is, Jesus, he tells them, listen, take your nets, cast them to the other side of the boat. You know, as soon as the disciple listened, they cast the net to the other side. They catch an enormous amount of fish like they did before, right? As soon as they caught the fish, they all excitedly exclaimed, Jesus, is that you? You know, Peter was so excited. This was, I guess, before whenever he denied Christ several times. Peter hurriedly jumps out of the boat, swims to Jesus, and excited, to see Jesus. And we see Jesus prepares for them a meal, and they're sitting together at this, I guess, and eating supper together. And I'm going to read verse 15 and down, right? Chapter 21 of John. So John 21, verse 15. So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to me, tend my lambs. He said to him again a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to them, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, shepherd my sheep. Verse 17. He said to him the third time, Simon, the son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all these things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, tend my sheep. Verse 20. Peter, turning around, saw the disciple who Jesus loved following them. the one who also had leaned back on his bosom at supper and said, Lord, who is the one who betrays you? So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? Jesus said to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. If I want him to remain till I come, what is that to you? Follow me. You know, at the beginning of my sermon, the title of my sermon is Stop Comparing. What is it to you? You know, just as Saul, just as the people of Israel, and just as so often we live lives of comparison, right? Peter, apostle, a disciple, the one who loved God so much, had the very same exact problem, had the very same exact issue. Everybody knows that John, the story is talking about John. John was, I don't know if we could say he was the favorite of Jesus, but it says that Jesus loved John, and the disciples, they seen this. They seen how John was so close to Jesus. They seen how John was the baby, I guess, of their group, that Jesus loved him so much. And whenever Peter began to compare his life, whenever Peter began to compare his situation, whenever Peter began to compare his relationship with Jesus, it was not the same that as of John. Maybe John was maybe John believed more. Maybe John loved Jesus more. Maybe John spent more time with Jesus, not as much as Peter. And Peter looks at John with this view of comparing his own relationship, the way John lived his life. And Jesus turns to Peter and says, hey, Peter, what is it to you? Who cares how he is living? Who cares how he is worshiping me? Who cares how he is praying to me? Who cares how much time he's spending with me? What is it to you? You live your own life. I have something special prepared for you. I have something greater for you. Your life is unique and different than John's. You need to stop comparing. You need to live your life and be filled with joy and to be filled with my presence. Stop comparing. Church, as I conclude my sermon, I encourage you guys, whenever we have moments of comparison in our lives, whenever we will look at somebody, what somebody has achieved or obtained, or maybe that God has blessed them with something specific, don't compare. Don't look at them. Stop looking. Stop paying attention to those people because they are not you. You are God's son. You're God's daughter. You are unique and special in every way. And He has something far more for your life, for my life. Something better. Something precious. And I just pray, let's get into prayer, that God gives us that spirit where we don't compare. That we don't look at other people, but we are grateful and we are satisfied and thankful and content, for what God has given us. Let's pray.